The dust of redemption settled on everything, a fine ochre powder that clung to good intentions and bad deeds with equal indifference. It coated the brim of Jack Thorne's hat, settled in the lines around his eyes, and muted the shine on his worn leather boots. Inside the First Redemption Bank, the air was still and thick with the smell of old paper-oiled steel from the vault door and the faint cloying scent of the teller's bay rum tonic. Jack stood in line, a ghost among the living, his body going through the motions of a respectable rancher, while his mind drifted elsewhere to a quiet plot of land marked by a simple wooden cross. He was tracing the grain of the polished oak counter when the front doors burst open, slamming against the interior walls with a sound like a gunshot. The midday sun, previously a benign warmth through the large glass windows, became a harsh, blinding spotlight, silhouetting 5 figures against the street. They moved with a predatory economy, fanning out to cover the room, their faces obscured by dusty bandanas. The murmur of civilian life died instantly, replaced by a silence so profound Jack could hear the frantic beat of his own heart. He remained still, his rancher's posture a carefully constructed lie. His hands, calloused from mending fences and breaking horses, stayed loose at his sides, but his eyes, the color of a winter sky, missed nothing. He catalogued them, 5 men, all armed with Colt revolvers. 4 were nervous, their movements jerky, their eyes darting around the room like spooked cattle. The 5th was different. He was tall and moved with a fluid grace that was more dangerous than the nervous energy of his men. He stepped into the center of the room, his long duster coat settling around him like a shroud. He pulled down his bandana, revealing a face that was handsome in a severe way, with intelligent eyes and a mouth that seemed perpetually poised between a smile and a sneer. "Good afternoon, citizens of Redemption," he said, his voice calm and articulate, carrying easily through the cavern of silence. "My name is Silas Kane, and for the next few minutes, this establishment operates under new management. Please do not make this a memorable occasion for the wrong reasons." Jack's blood ran cold. He had heard the name. Whispers from traveling merchants, grim reports from the territorial marshals who passed through town. Kane wasn't a common outlaw. He was a phantom striking with precision and disappearing without a trace, leaving behind a trail of meticulously executed crimes and a growing legend of ruthless intelligence. While Kane directed the terrified tellers to fill their saddlebags, his men moved among the customers. They were professionals taking wallets and watches with a cold, impersonal efficiency. One of them, a young man with panicked eyes, approached Jack. "Your valuables, old man," the outlaw said, his voice cracking. Jack slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet, handing it over. He kept his gaze down, playing the part of a cowed rancher. The outlaw's greedy fingers fumbled with the clasp, but his eyes were drawn to the silver chain that disappeared into Jack's vest pocket. "What's that?" "Nothing," Jack said, his voice a low growl. "A keepsake. Let me see it." The outlaw's hand darted out, grabbing the chain. Jack's hand shot up, his fingers clamping around the boy's wrist like a manacle. For a fleeting second, the rancher disappeared, and the lawman looked out from his eyes, hard, cold, and absolute. The boy recoiled, fear flashing in his eyes, but it was too late. The chain snapped. The outlaw stumbled back, a small, heart-shaped silver locket swinging from his fist. "Leave it." Jack's voice was dangerously quiet. The commotion drew Silas Kane's attention. He turned from the vault, his placid demeanor unchanged, but a new calculating light entered his eyes. He walked toward them, his spurs ringing a death knell on the wooden floor. "Is there a problem?" Virgil Kane asked, his tone mild. He didn't want to give this up," Virgil stammered, holding up the locket. Kane took the locket from his man's hand, his long fingers turning it over. It was old, the silver worn smooth with time and touch. He pressed the small clasp, and it sprang open, revealing a miniature hand-painted portrait on a sliver of ivory. A woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Eleanor. Kane studied the portrait, then looked at Jack, a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze. "A beautiful woman. Your wife?" Jack didn't answer. He just stared at the locket in Kane's hand, a hollow ache spreading through his chest. Every man has something he can't bear to lose. Kane said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. He snapped the locket shut, the click echoing in the silent bank. Instead of returning it, he slipped it into his own vest pocket. I'm simply here to remind you of that. He turned to his men. We're done here. The gang backed out of the bank, their guns still trained on the frozen customers. The last thing Jack saw was Silas Kane, pausing in the doorway, his eyes meeting Jack's one last time. There was no triumph in his look, no greed. There was something else, something that felt chillingly like judgment. The moment the doors swung shut, the bank erupted into a cacophony of sobs and shouts. Jack remained motionless, his hand unconsciously pressed to the empty space on his vest where the locket should have been. The stolen money meant nothing. His wallet was a trifle. But that locket was the last piece of a life he had failed to protect, a promise he had failed to keep. In the dusty, violated silence of the Redemption Bank, Jack Thorne, the rancher, died, and a ghost from a much harder life began to stir. The sun bled out across the western horizon, painting the baked earth in hues of bruised purple and fiery orange. Jack's ranch was a lonely silhouette against the dying light, a testament to a life pared down to its barest essentials. The small, sturdy house he had built with his own hands felt less like a home and more like a waiting room for a train that was never going to arrive. Inside, the silence was a physical presence. He moved through the sparse rooms, his boots echoing on the plank floors. In the main room, a stone hearth stood cold and dark. On the mantel, a single framed photograph was the room's only ornament. It was a formal portrait of him and Eleanor on their wedding day, her smile radiant, his own expression stiff and unaccustomed to joy. Next to it, an empty space, a small dark patch on the wood, where dust had not yet settled. For 3 years the locket had rested there every night, a silent vigil to a shared past. He ran his knuckles over the vacant spot, the wood cool against his skin. Grief was not a storm, he had learned. It was a climate. It was the air you breathed, the ground you walked on, the quiet ache that lived behind your ribs. He had come to Redemption to escape the man he had been, U.S. Marshal John Thorne, a name synonymous with relentless pursuit and unbending justice. He had traded his badge for a branding iron, his revolver for a shovel, hoping the sweat and toil of an honest life could scour the blood from his memory. He had buried John Thorne, but he had failed to bury his ghosts. Eleanor was the most persistent. She hadn't died by a bullet or a blade, the kind of death he understood and knew how to avenge. A fever had stolen her, a silent, merciless thief that had wasted her away while he stood by helpless. He who had faced down killers and stared into the abyss without flinching could do nothing but hold her hand and watch the light fade from her eyes. The locket was all he had left of her, a tangible piece of a life that felt more like a dream with each passing year. The following morning, Sheriff Brody found him mending a fence line at the edge of his property. Brody was a good man, weary and pragmatic, his face a roadmap of long years spent trying to impose order on a land that actively resisted it. "Heard what happened?" Jack Brody said, dismounting from his horse. "You all right?" Jack didn't stop his work pulling the wire taut before hammering in a staple. "I'm fine. Kane's gang is long gone, vanished like smoke. We put the telegraph to work, but my guess is they've gone to ground somewhere in the high country. We'll never find them." 5 men, one with cold eyes. Jack said, his voice flat. He hammered another staple with sharp final blows. "Yeah, that's Kane." Brody sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "He's different. Smarter. The money's gone, Jack. The bank will cover the losses, but whatever they took from you personally, you should probably count it as lost. They took a locket." Brody's expression softened. "I know. Belonged to your wife, didn't it?" He paused. "I'm sorry, Jack. But it's just a thing. It's not worth your life. Jack finally stopped working and looked at the sheriff. His eyes were clear and hard. Some things are. Brody saw the change in him then. The quiet rancher was gone, and in his place was a man Brody had only heard stories about. Don't do it, Jack. Let the law handle it. You're not that man anymore. The law can't find them, Jack said, turning back to his fence. That man can. Later that day, Jack rode into Redemption. The town was still buzzing with nervous energy from the robbery. He passed the smithy, the scent of hot iron and coal smoke filling the air. He nodded at the undertaker who was leaning in his doorway, a man whose business was always steady. He stopped at the general store, the bell above the door, announcing his arrival with a cheerful jingle that felt entirely out of place. Clara May, the proprietor, stood behind the counter. She was a widow like him, though her grief was a softer thing worn with a quiet grace that Jack found both admirable and slightly unnerving. She had kind eyes and a way of speaking that smoothed the rough edges of the world. Jack, she said, her voice gentle, I heard you were in the bank. I'm so glad you're safe. I need supplies, Clara, he said, his tone leaving no room for sympathy. Cartridges for a Winchester, 45-70, and a Colt, and enough dried rations for 2 weeks. Clara's smile faltered. She looked at the hard set of his jaw, the cold fire in his eyes. She didn't ask questions. She had lived in the West long enough to recognize when a man had crossed a line within himself from which there was no easy return. She gathered the items in silence, her movements efficient. As she boxed the ammunition, her hand brushed his. Her touch was warm, a brief spark of human connection in the cold resolve that had enveloped him. Whatever you're planning, Jack, she whispered, please come back. He met her gaze, and for a moment he saw a flicker of the life he was about to leave behind. A life of quiet decency, of shared compassion. With a woman who understood loss. It was a tempting vision, but it was a mirage. His path led not toward a new life, but back into the darkness of an old one. He paid for the supplies and walked out without another word, the bell above the door sounding a lonely farewell. Back at the ranch, he unlocked a heavy wooden chest that had sat dormant at the foot of his bed for 3 years. The air that escaped smelled of gun oil and old leather. Inside, nestled in felt lining, was his past. A U.S. Marshal's badge, its silver tarnished. A well-oiled Colt Peacemaker, its weight familiar and comforting in his hand. And a gun belt, the leather supple and molded to the shape of his body. He strapped on the belt, the gesture as natural as breathing. He loaded the Colt and the Winchester, the metallic clicks of the mechanisms sounding like the ticking of a clock, counting down to a final violent appointment. He packed the rations, a bedroll, and a canteen. As dusk settled, he saddled his horse, a powerful buckskin that had only ever known the slow pace of a rancher's life. Jack swung into the saddle and looked back at the small house one last time. It was just a building now, an empty shell. His home, the one that mattered, was gone, stolen by a man with cold eyes who had no idea what he had truly taken. He turned the horse north toward the jagged peaks that clawed at the twilight sky. He didn't know where Silas Kane was, but he knew the kind of country a man like that would seek. He let the reins go slack, letting the horse pick its way through the skeletal sagebrush as he opened his senses. The lawman had been buried, but he had not been forgotten. Jack Thorne was awake now, and he was hunting. The wilderness that stretched north of Redemption was a harsh, unforgiving canvas of cracked earth and primordial rock. Jack moved through it, not as a rancher, but as he had for 20 years prior, a reader of stories left in the dust. He saw the tale of the gang's passage written in the smallest of details. The deep, hurried prints of 5 shod horses, their gait, telling him they were riding hard and fast. A discarded cigar, still faintly damp, told him one of the riders was nervous. The way their trail skirted a known waterhole suggested they had their own supply, meaning they were well equipped and planning to stay hidden for some time. For 2 days, he tracked them, his own presence as faint as a whisper on the wind. He ate in the saddle, slept in short, watchful bursts, became a part of the landscape, another shadow in a land of shadows. The trail led him higher into the labyrinthine canyons of the San Juan foothills. The air grew thinner, cooler. The world became a vertical puzzle of stone and sky. He found their first camp on the 3rd day. It was sloppy. A still smoldering fire, empty bean cans, fresh horse droppings. Amateurs. Cain was a professional, but his men were not. This was a vulnerability Jack could exploit. He also found something else. A single spent cartridge casing different from the others. It was from a Spencer carbine, an older model military issue. It was an odd choice for an outlaw. He pocketed the casing, the brass cool against his palm, and moved on. The trail grew fresher. He was closing the distance. By late afternoon, he smelled wood smoke on the breeze. He dismounted, leaving his horse tethered in a grove of stunted pines, and proceeded on foot, his movements silent and deliberate. He climbed a rocky outcrop, the stone rough under his hands, and peered down into a narrow box canyon. Below, the gang had made camp. 4 men were gathered around a fire, their voices echoing faintly off the canyon walls. The 5th, a sentry, was posted near the canyon's entrance, but he was lazy, his attention more on the stew cooking over the fire than on the ridge above him. Jack scanned the camp for Silas Kane, but didn't see him. It was too easy. The careless camp, the distracted sentry, Kane's absence. A cold knot of certainty tightened in Jack's gut. This wasn't a camp. It was bait. His eyes swept the opposite ridge, searching for the telltale glint of sunlight on a rifle barrel, the unnatural shape of a man concealed among the rocks. He found it. A lone figure nestled in a sniper's perch, a long-barreled rifle resting on a rocky ledge. The man was patient, perfectly still, almost invisible, and he was looking directly at the spot where Jack had first crested the ridge. Kane hadn't just anticipated he would be followed. He had anticipated how he would be followed. He knew a skilled tracker would approach from high ground. He had set a trap for a lawman. Jack eased back from the ledge, his heart hammering a steady, cold rhythm. He had 2 choices: retreat and be picked off by the sniper as he fled, or move first and turn the trap on its head. He slid the Winchester from his shoulder. The range was long, close to 300 yards, with a tricky crosswind whipping through the canyon. It was a shot few men would even attempt. He took a slow, deep breath, letting it out until his lungs were empty. He thought of Eleanor's smile in the locket, the last image he had of her. He settled the rifle stock against his shoulder, found the sniper in his sights, and led him by a fraction, compensating for the wind. He exhorted the stillness he had learned over years of long, lonely vigils, the world narrowing to the front sight of his rifle and the distant, unsuspecting figure. He squeezed the trigger. The Winchester bucked against his shoulder, its report a deafening crack in the high country silence. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then the figure on the far ridge slumped sideways and slid from view. All hell broke loose in the canyon below. The 4 outlaws scrambled for their guns, shouting in confusion, firing wildly at the ridge where Jack had been. But Jack was already gone, melting back into the rocks, using the echoes and chaos to mask his movement. He circled around the head of the canyon, his path a silent, deadly arc. He came upon them from the side, from a direction they never expected. He didn't fire to kill. He fired to disable. A bullet kicked dirt into the face of one man, momentarily blinding him. Another shot splintered the stock of a rifle just as it was being raised. He moved like a phantom, his shots coming from different positions, making one man seem like 3. The outlaws, their leader gone and their sniper silenced, broke. They were bank robbers, not soldiers. 2 of them scrambled for their horses and fled down the canyon. The other 2, pinned down and terrified, threw down their guns. "We give up, don't shoot." Jack emerged from the rocks, his Winchester held steady. He looked at the 2 surrendered men, their faces pale with fear. They were boys barely old enough to shave. Where is he? Jack's voice was gravel. Where's Kane? Don't know, one of them stammered. He left yesterday, said he had business to attend to. Told us to wait here for him. What business? He didn't say. He told us someone might come looking for him. A man from Redemption. An old lawman pretending to be a rancher. He said to kill you if you showed up. The words hit Jack with the force of a physical blow. Kane knew who he was. This wasn't a random robbery. It was personal. The trap hadn't been for a generic tracker. It had been specifically for John Thorne. He tied the two men up, leaving them for the sheriff to find. As he searched the camp for any clue to Kane's destination, he found something near the cold ashes of a separate, smaller fire away from the main camp. It was a small, hand-carved bird whittled from a piece of pine. The craftsmanship was simple but elegant, the lines clean and sure. Jack picked it up, the wood smooth in his calloused palm. A chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air traced its way down his spine. The bird was familiar. It sparked a dark, fragmented memory, something he had locked away in the deepest vault of his mind. A memory of smoke and shouting and the smell of blood on a cold winter's day. He couldn't place it, but he knew with a dreadful certainty that this small wooden bird was not a clue. It was a message. And it meant that Silas Kane knew far more about him than he could possibly have imagined. The ride back to Redemption was a grim, silent journey. Jack pushed the horse hard, the wooden bird a heavy weight in his saddlebag, a talisman of a past he could no longer outrun. He left the two captured outlaws with a stunned Sheriff Brody, offering no explanation beyond Kane's work before riding on. He needed to think to piece together the fragments of a puzzle that felt vast and terrifying. He bypassed his empty ranch and rode straight to the telegraph office. Under the pretense of checking on a cattle shipment, he sent a series of coded messages to a former colleague at the U.S. Marshal's headquarters in Denver. He asked for files on Silas Kane, but also for a list of recent high-profile crimes in the territory. He was looking for a pattern, a logic that transcended simple greed. For 2 days, he waited. He stayed at the town's boarding house, a stranger among the people he had called neighbors. He saw Clara at the market, her expression a mixture of relief and concern. He only nodded the chasm between his world and hers, now too wide to cross with simple pleasantries. He was a man haunted, and his ghosts were beginning to take shape. The reply from Denver came in a staccato of clicking Morse code. The telegraph operator, a young man with a green eye shade, handed Jack the decoded sheets with a curious look. Jack took them to a quiet corner of the saloon, the smell of stale beer and sawdust, a familiar backdrop to the grim work of a lawman. The file on Kane was thin. He had appeared a year ago, seemingly from nowhere. No history, no known associates before his current gang. But the list of his crimes was illuminating. He hadn't just robbed banks. He had hit a federal land office in Telluride, burning all the deeds and records. He had derailed a train carrying payroll for the new railroad spur, taking the money, but also destroying a newly built trestle bridge. He had robbed a stagecoach, carrying a territorial judge, taking his money, but also burning all his legal documents. Jack spread the papers on the rough-hewn table. It wasn't about money. Kane was attacking the very sinews of law and progress. He was erasing things, deeds, legal papers, symbols of civilization's encroachment. It was a campaign of surgical destruction. Then he saw it. A detail in the report about the land office fire in Telluride. The local marshal noted an oddity found in the ashes, a small hand-carved children's toy. A wooden horse. The memory, blurry and indistinct, slammed into him. The wooden bird in his saddlebag felt like it was burning a hole through the leather. He pulled it out, its simple form, a stark contrast to the complex, ugly truth beginning to dawn on him. He closed his eyes, forcing himself back through the years back, through a wall of guilt and regret he had built brick by brick. He was a younger man, a U.S. Marshal at the peak of his career. It was winter. The snow was deep, the air sharp enough to cut. He was leading a posse hunting a gang of rustlers known as the Miller Boys. His informant, a paid snitch with shifty eyes, had sworn their hideout was an isolated homestead in the Animas Valley. The raid was planned for dawn. They surrounded the cabins shouting for surrender. The response was a hail of gunfire. The posse returned fire, a brutal, chaotic exchange in the gray morning light. When the shooting stopped and the smoke cleared, Jack was the first one through the door. The scene inside had frozen in his memory, a tableau of horror. The Miller Boys weren't there. It was a family. A man slumped over a table, a half-finished wooden bird in his hand. A woman by the hearth, a rifle she had never learned to properly use, lying beside her. And in a small bedroom, 2 children, a boy and a girl, caught in the crossfire. The boy was clutching a small wooden horse. The informant had given him bad intelligence. The homesteader, a man named Kane, had a passing resemblance to one of the Miller Boys and had been known to trade with them. It was a mistake. A catastrophic, unforgivable mistake. Jack's raid, his unbending pursuit of justice, had annihilated an innocent family. The official report was sanitized. A tragic case of mistaken identity. Regrets were expressed. Jack was cleared of any wrongdoing, but the guilt was a cancer on his soul. He had resigned his commission a month later, unable to wear the badge that now felt like a brand of shame. He had buried the memory-buried Marshal John Thorne and tried to disappear into the quiet life of a rancher named Jack. He opened his eyes at the saloon's dim light, feeling harsh and accusatory. He looked at the wooden bird in his hand. Silas Kane. It had been the father's name. He had survived. The man Jack had made a widower, the man whose children he had killed, was alive, and he wanted revenge. It all clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Kane knew who he was, because Jack had been the man who destroyed his life. He was attacking symbols of the law because the law had failed him. He stole the locket not for its value, but for what it represented: Jack's own lost family, his own vulnerability. He had been toying with Jack, leading him on a chase, leaving clues that were not meant to be solved, but to be remembered. He wasn't just trying to kill Jack's body. He was systematically dismantling his peace, his new identity, his soul. The hunt was no longer for a thief. It was a reckoning. Jack Thorne stood up from the table, the papers falling to the floor. The ghosts were no longer whispering. They were screaming, and they were calling him to a final bloody atonement. The knowledge changed the air Jack breathed. Every shadow seemed to hold a memory. Every gust of wind seemed to whisper a name. He now understood that he wasn't the hunter. He was the hunted, and his pursuer had been orchestrating his every move for a year. Kane, armed with the terrible clarity of a man who has lost everything, was not just seeking revenge. He was seeking a very specific kind of justice, written in fire and fear. Jack knew he couldn't wait for Kane's next move. He had to force his hand to draw him out from the shadows. But Kane was always a step ahead. The blow came not from the wilderness, but from the heart of redemption itself. One night, a pillar of fire clawed at the sky on the edge of town. Jack was on his feet before the first frantic ringing of the church bell, a cold dread coiling in his stomach. He knew with absolute certainty what was burning: the new schoolhouse. It was little more than a one-room cabin, but it was the town's proudest achievement, a symbol of its hopes for the future. Jack had donated most of the lumber and helped raise the walls himself, the simple, honest work a balm for his troubled spirit. He had imagined children's laughter filling the small room, a sound of life and promise. Now it was an inferno. The townsfolk formed a desperate bucket brigade from the town well, but it was a futile effort against the roaring flames. The dry timber, a gift from Jack, now served as perfect fuel for Kane's message. Jack stood apart from the crowd, watching the symbol of his new life turn to ash. He felt the heat on his face, but inside He was ice cold. Sheriff Brody found him there, his face streaked with soot and despair. "It's Kane," Brody said, his voice raw. "They rode in, set the fire, and were gone before anyone could stop them. They didn't take a thing. They just did this." It was a message, Jack said, his eyes fixed on the collapsing roof. "For me." As the fire began to die down, revealing the charred skeleton of the building, they saw it. Pinned to the smoldering doorframe by a large bone-handled knife was a piece of paper. Jack walked toward it, the heat still radiating in waves. He recognized the knife. It was the one he had seen in the hand of the dead carver in that snowbound cabin all those years ago. He pulled the knife from the wood. The paper was a page torn from a ledger, the back of it covered in precise, elegant script. "The house of knowledge is so easily unmade, Marshal. Just like a house of flesh and blood. You built this place of hope on the ashes of my family. It seems only fitting that it should burn. I have chosen a place for our final conversation. A place where men go to seek forgiveness. The old church on Sentinel Peak. Come alone. Come at sundown tomorrow. Let us see if your God offers absolution for men like us." Sentinel Peak. A dramatic windswept bluff that overlooked the entire valley. A half-finished church stood there, abandoned years ago, when the founding pastor had fallen from the cliffs. It was a place of ghosts and bad memories, a perfect stage for Kane's final act. "You can't go, Jack," Brody said, reading the note over his shoulder. "It's a trap. I'll gather a posse." "A posse would be massacred." Jack replied, his voice devoid of emotion. "He's expecting me to bring one. He wants me alone. This is between him and me. It always has been." He turned to Clara, who had appeared at the edge of the crowd, her face pale in the firelight, her eyes wide with fear. He saw in her face the life he could have had, the peace that Kane was methodically burning away. "Stay inside tomorrow," he told her, his voice softer than he intended. "Lock your doors." She reached out her hand, resting on his arm. "Don't go. Whatever he took, it's not worth this. He didn't just take something, Clara," Jack said, looking from her compassionate face to the smoldering ruins. "He's giving something back. A reckoning." He spent the rest of the night preparing. He cleaned his Colt and his Winchester until they gleamed. He counted his cartridges, laying them out in neat rows like soldiers before a battle. He was not just preparing for a gunfight. He was preparing for a confession. His crime had not been one of malice, but of pride and blind certainty. He had been so sure of his own righteousness as a lawman that he had never stopped to consider the cost. Tomorrow Silas Kane would present him with the bill. As the sun began to rise, casting long shadows across the valley, Jack rode out of redemption. He did not look back. The town, with its simple hopes and quiet lives, belonged to a world he was no longer a part of. He was riding toward a derelict church on a lonely cliff, a man stripped of his aliases and his illusions to face the living ghost of his greatest sin. The climb to Sentinel Peak was a pilgrimage into a sky bruised with the promise of a storm. Dark, heavy clouds gathered on the horizon, and the wind whispered through the pines with a mournful sound. The air grew heavy, charged with an almost electric tension, mirroring the storm building inside Jack's soul. The derelict church stood on the cliff's edge like a skeletal accusation against the churning gray sky. Its walls were raised, but the roof was never finished, leaving the heavens as its only ceiling. The wind moaned through the empty window frames, a choir of desolation. Jack dismounted at the base of the peak and made the final approach on foot, his Winchester in hand. He moved with the practiced stealth of his former life, using the rocks and twisted junipers for cover. He saw them before they saw him. Two of Kane's men were positioned as lookouts, but their attention was focused down the main trail, expecting a direct approach. Jack circled wide a ghost in the gloaming and entered the church from the rear through a gap in the chancel wall. Silas Kane stood at the far end of the nave before a simple stone altar, his back to the entrance. He was alone. The setting sun broke through a gap in the clouds, bathing him in a final bloody shaft of light. "I knew you would come," Marshal Kane said without turning. "A man like you can never leave a debt unpaid." "This isn't about debt," Jack said, his voice echoing in the stone shell. "It's about a mistake. A tragedy." Kane turned slowly. His face was a mask of cold, controlled fury. "A mistake is when a rancher miscounts his herd thorn. A tragedy is when a child dies of a fever. What you did was an execution. You were judge, jury, and executioner for a family whose only crime was living on land your informant wanted." The wind howled, and the first fat drops of rain began to fall, spattering against the stone floor like tears. A low rumble of thunder echoed from the distant mountains. "My wife Sarah was a good woman," Kane continued, his voice low and intense. "She saw beauty in a hard land. My son Daniel, he was going to be a builder. He could make anything with his hands. And my little girl, Lily, she had a laugh that could make the wildflowers grow." He took a step forward. "You didn't just kill them. You erased them. You filed a report full of lies, and you walked away." "I didn't lie," Jack said, his voice tight. "The report said it was a mistake, but you buried the truth." Kane's voice rose to a roar, competing with the rising storm. "You buried the truth of your own incompetence. Your pride, you let the world believe my family died because they were associated with outlaws, and you disappeared, hoping the guilt would fade. But it doesn't fade, does it, Marshal? It festers." Lightning split the sky, illuminating the stark agony on Kane's face. In that flash, Jack didn't see a monster. He saw a husband and a father, trapped in an endless moment of loss. "I have lived with it every day," Jack said, the confession torn from him. "You have lived," Kane spat. "My family is dust. I have spent years searching for you, watching you build this pathetic new life, this monument to your own forgetting. I wanted you to feel it. I wanted you to watch everything you care about turn to ash, just as I did." From the shadows behind the altar, Kane's last two men emerged, rifles leveled. Jack had expected them. He raised his Winchester. The church erupted in a symphony of violence. Gunfire and thunder became one. Lightning flashes provided strobing glimpses of the battle. Jack diving behind a pile of old timbers, Kane taking cover behind the stone altar, the two henchmen firing from the wings. The rain was coming down in sheets now, making the floor slick, soaking them all to the bone. Jack moved with lethal efficiency. He was outnumbered, but he was the superior tactician. He used the echoing acoustics of the church to his advantage, making his shots seem to come from everywhere at once. One of the henchmen went down a cry, lost in a clap of thunder. The other panicked, broke from cover, and Jack's Colt barked once, silencing him. Now it was just him and Kane. They circled each other in the storm-lashed church, two ghosts locked in a final desperate dance. "It ends now," Kane Jack yelled over the wind. "Yes," Kane agreed, rising from behind the altar, his pistol steady. "It does." They fired at the same instant. A hot poker of pain seared Jack's side, and he stumbled back, his ribs screaming. His own shot went true, hitting Kane's gun hand. The pistol clattered to the stone floor. Kane clutched his bleeding hand, his face contorted in pain, but also in triumph. Jack staggered forward, his vision blurring. He had Kane disarmed, helpless. He raised his Colt for the final shot. "No, Jack." The voice came from the main entrance of the church. Jack turned, his heart seizing in his chest. Clara stood there, drenched by the rain, her face a pale oval in the gloom. In her hands, she held a small revolver, and it was pointed directly at him. "Clara!" "What are you doing?" he gasped, the pain in his side, a dull spreading fire. "He was my brother, Jack," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "Silas is my brother." The world tilted on its axis. The kind widow, the compassionate store owner, the woman who had shown him tenderness, It had all been a lie. Your sister found me a year ago, Kane said, a grim smile on his lips. She told me a retired lawman haunted by his wife's death had settled in redemption. A man who matched your description. She got close to you. She learned your routines, your weaknesses. She told me about the locket. The betrayal was a wound far deeper than the bullet in his side. Every kind word, every gentle touch had been a calculated move in Kane's cruel game. He had been a fly caught in a web he had never even seen. "I'm sorry," Jack, Clara said, tears streaming down her face, mingling with the rain. "He's the only family I have left. You took the rest." Jack stood between them, the brother and the sister, the two surviving pieces of a family he had shattered. He looked from Kane's face filled with righteous hate to Clara's torn by love and vengeance. He lowered his gun. He was beaten, not by bullets, but by the crushing weight of his own past. The moment Jack's gun dipped, the world fractured. Kane, seeing his chance, lunged not at Jack, but at the pistol he had dropped. Clara, seeing her brother's reckless move, cried out, "Silas, no." The distraction was all Jack needed. He didn't raise his gun to fire. He threw himself forward, crashing his shoulder into Kane's chest, sending them both sliding across the slick stone floor. They were no longer lawman and outlaw. They were just two men fueled by grief and rage. Jack's fist connected with Kane's jaw. Kane drove an elbow into Jack's wounded side, and the world exploded in white-hot pain. Clara screamed, her small revolver wavering between the two struggling figures. She couldn't get a clear shot. The fight was brutal, primal. They rolled through puddles of rainwater, their grunts and curses lost in the storm. Jack was stronger, but Kane was fueled by a madness born of years of loss. He fought like a cornered animal, all teeth and claws. He managed to get his hands on Jack's throat, his thumbs pressing down, stealing the air from Jack's lungs. Jack's vision started to dim. The edges of the world went dark. He saw Eleanor's face, her gentle smile. He had failed her then, and he was failing now. Through the roaring in his ears, he heard a new sound, the scrape of stone on stone. His groping hand had found a loose piece of flagstone broken from the floor. With the last of his strength, he swung it, connecting with the side of Kane's head. Kane's grip loosened. He slumped sideways, his eyes rolling back unconscious. Jack lay on the cold floor, gasping for air, the rain washing the blood and grime from his face. He pushed himself up, his body screaming in protest. He looked at Clara. She stood frozen, the gun still in her hand, her face a mask of horror and indecision. The storm began to break. The thunder receded, and the torrential rain softened to a steady drumming. In the relative quiet, the sound of approaching horses reached them. Sheriff Brody and his posse. Clara looked from her unconscious brother to the approaching law, then to Jack. Her fight was over. Slowly she lowered the gun and let it fall from her numb fingers. Jack stood over the defeated Kane as Brody and his men filled the church, their lanterns casting dancing, distorted shadows on the wet stone walls. The sheriff took in the scene, the two dead outlaws, the unconscious Kane, the shattered Clara, and Jack bleeding and exhausted, but alive. "I told you not to come alone," Brody said, his voice a mix of exasperation and relief. Jack didn't answer. He looked at Clara, who was being gently led away by one of the deputies. She wouldn't meet his eyes. There was nothing left to say. He walked over to Kane's still form and knelt. From Kane's vest pocket, he retrieved the silver locket. It was warm from the man's body heat. He closed his fist around it, the familiar shape, a cold comfort in his palm. In the aftermath, back in the sheriff's office, the whole sordid story came out. Jack held nothing back. He told Brody about the raid, about the innocent family, about his guilt and his retirement. He explained Kane's motives, Clara's role, the whole twisted quest for vengeance that had culminated in the storm-lashed church. He took responsibility for every action past and present that had led them to this point. Brody listened in silence, his expression grim. When Jack was finished, the sheriff leaned back in his chair. The territory will want to hang Kane, and his sister will likely face a long prison sentence. He looked at Jack, his gaze steady. And you brought down one of the most wanted gangs in the region. You stopped a killer. As far as the law is concerned, you're a hero. I'm no hero, Jack said quietly. The posse had recovered the saddlebags from Kane's camp. They were filled with the stolen money from a dozen crimes. The bank's share was returned, but a significant amount taken from payrolls and land offices outside of Redemption's jurisdiction was left in a legal limbo. Brody slid a heavy bag across the desk toward Jack. There are reward bounties on Kane's men. This is yours. Officially. Jack looked at the bag of money, then at the locket resting on the desk beside it. He was left with the spoils of his war blood money, a piece of his past returned to him, and a town that now saw him not as a simple rancher, but as a man with a history as dark and violent as the lands around them. The peace he had sought in Redemption was gone, forever shattered by the ghosts he had failed to outrun. In the weeks that followed, a strange quiet settled over Redemption. The story of Jack Thorne and Silas Kane became a local legend told in hushed tones in the saloon and the general store. Jack retreated to his ranch, the silence of his small house no longer a comfort, but a heavy blanket of solitude. The bag of bounty money sat on his kitchen table untouched. Every time he looked at it, he saw the faces of Kane's family. He saw the fire that consumed the schoolhouse. It was the price of his past, and he wanted no part of it. One morning, he rode into town and went to see the town council. He emptied the bag onto their meeting table. I want to rebuild the school, he said, his voice clear and firm. And I want to build an orphanage, a place for children who have lost their families. He paused, the words heavy with unspoken meaning. It will be dedicated to the memory of the Kane family. Sarah, Daniel, and Lily. It was an act of public penance, an atonement he knew would never be complete. But it was a start. It was a way to build something life-affirming on a foundation of death and destruction. Clara, awaiting trial, heard of his plan. From her cell she sent him a letter. Her elegant script was shaky now. She did not ask for forgiveness. She asked if she could work at the orphanage when her debt to society was paid. She wanted to spend her life honoring the family she had helped to destroy through her own blind loyalty and grief. Jack wrote back with a single word, yes. It was a complex and uncertain hope, but it was hope nonetheless. That afternoon, Jack took the locket and rode out to the small windswept hill where Eleanor was buried. For 3 years, he had clung to this object as his last connection to her, a tangible symbol of his love and his failure. He had started a war for it. He opened the delicate silver heart and looked at her smiling face. He no longer saw a ghost to be mourned, but a memory to be cherished. He was not the same man who had lost her. The journey into his past had paradoxically freed him from it. He understood now that her memory wasn't trapped in a silver cage. It lived in the man she had helped him become. With his bare hands, he dug a small hole in the earth at the foot of her grave marker. He kissed the locket one last time, whispered a final goodbye, and placed it in the ground. As he covered it with soil, he felt a weight lift from his soul, a burden he had carried for so long, he had forgotten what it was like to stand up straight. He was no longer chained to his grief. He was ready to build a new future. A few days later, Sheriff Brody brought him a small sealed crate containing Silas Kane's personal effects. He'll be transported to the federal prison next week, Brody said. Figured you might want to look through this. Jack pried open the crate. Inside were a few worn books, a spare set of clothes, and a small leather-bound journal. Tucked inside the journal was a sealed envelope addressed simply to Marshall. He recognized Kane's precise handwriting. He broke the seal, his hand steady. The letter was dated the day of the confrontation at the church. Marshall Thorne. If you are reading this, then I have failed, and you have survived. I suspect you believe this was all for revenge. In a way it was, but not the way you think. I did not want to simply kill you. Death is too easy an escape. I wanted to force you to remember. I wanted the world to know that my wife and children were not collateral damage in the pursuit of justice. They were innocent. They had names. Their lives mattered. My true goal was never your death, but your confession. I wanted you to stand in the ruins of your new life and speak the truth of what you had done, not to me, but to yourself and to the world. Only then could the souls of my family find peace. Only then could their memory be honored, not as footnotes in a lawman's sanitized report, but as the victims of a terrible wrong. My sister does not know of this. Her love for me is absolute, and she believes she is helping me seek vengeance. Forgive her if you can. Her only crime was loving what was left of her family. I do not know what awaits me now, but my work is done. You remember their names. That is all the justice I could hope for in this world. Silas Kane. Jack folded the letter, a profound sense of peace settling over him. He finally understood. Kane's entire campaign had been a twisted, grief-fueled quest, not for vengeance, but for truth. It was a father's desperate attempt to reclaim the memory of his family from the indifference of history. Jack stood on his porch, the letter in his hand, and looked out at the vast, silent landscape. He was no longer a man running from his past, but a man who had faced it, reckoned with it, and built a future upon its ashes. The ghosts were quiet now, not gone, but integrated into the fabric of who he was. He was Jack Thorne, a rancher, a builder, a man who understood the true cost of justice and the enduring power of atonement. His path forward was clear, free from the shadows, leading toward the promise of a new school, a new orphanage, and a new life, forged in the crucible of a painful but necessary truth.